Is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, Madam Speaker. You know, it's easy and comfortable to think that sex trafficking only happens in countries outside the United States, and the truth is more than 100,000 children each and every year are at risk of being trafficked for commercial sex here in the United States, here in America. You know, we have a word for a situation when one group of people is dehumanized and they have their basic human rights snuffed out for someone else's economic gain, and that word is slavery. And the problem that we have today is not a thing of the past. It's not from some remote corner of the world that you can't find on a map. Slavery in the form of human trafficking is happening right now. It's happening in our cities, it's happening in our suburbs, it's happening in rural communities. It's happening in each and every one of our congressional districts. And I'm sad to say that Minneapolis, in Minnesota, my home state, has actually been listed as one of the 13th largest centers for sexual exploitation of children in the entire country. Now, I realize now how critical it is to educate our community about what I've learned from talking to victims like Diana, who became a 13-year-old trafficking victim. Diana didn't get a lot of love and attention from her family or from her mother. While she took it upon herself to take care of her siblings, her brothers, and her sister, she longed for someone else to give her some love and attention. She ended up being seduced by a man who promised to be, quote, her boyfriend. Well, guess what? He even, within days, at age 13, within days after running away with him, she found herself being trafficked in Chicago and in Philadelphia, without a home, separated from her family, and only a daring jump from a second-story window actually allowed her to escape. Now, many might think that if Deanna hadn't come from a different family situation, she wouldn't have been trafficked, and sadly, that's not the case. I'll never forget meeting also with the mother of another young woman named Brittany. Brittany was a very young girl who was violently raped, murdered, and then found for dead in a lot last February. Unlike Diana, Brittany had a loving family. She worked with children at a local recreation center. She taught dance lessons. And despite these circumstances, Brittany was also a victim of sex trafficking, but she was too embarrassed to speak out until it was too late. And as Brittany's mother told me, it doesn't matter if victims have a home, because if sex trafficking can happen to my daughter, it can happen to any young girl. And that's exactly what we're talking about. Young girls who are only 12, 13, or 14 years old. They're not old enough to have graduated from high school. They're not old enough to have voted in an election. They're not even old enough to have passed their driver's license exam. In fact, in most states, these girls would be considered criminals that should be incarcerated and charged with prostitution instead of being treated as victims. We found that criminalization only traumatizes these girls and actually isolates them from the community and the services that they need and that they deserve. And that's why, Madam Speaker, we need this legislation, H.R. 159, the Stop Exploitation Through Trafficking Act, which focuses on incentivizing states to have safe harbor laws. Safe harbor laws ensure that these girls are treated as victims. Safe harbor laws will give legal protection for minor victims and provide them with specialized social services. So we know that by bringing these victims out of the shadows, we can make sure they get the services they need, including medical and psychological treatment, housing, legal services, educational assistance, job training, and more. Law enforcement can then focus on actually bringing the perpetrators of these awful crimes to justice. And this bipartisan legislation incentivizes states to adopt these safe harbor laws so that we can expand on the successes that we've seen in states like Minnesota. It was in 2011 that Minnesota became the 5th state to approve state harbor legislation, safe harbor legislation. And after their safe harbor laws went into effect, guess what? Law enforcement in Minnesota began arresting more Johns than ever before, and human trafficking convictions more than doubled. Best practices evaluations by law enforcement and victims groups show that by removing the fear of prosecution from victims, this actually works. Now today, only a little over a dozen states have full safe harbor laws, so we've got to do more to protect these victims and ensure that the pimps and the Johns are brought to justice. This legislation also helps victims by codifying a national human trafficking hotline and making victims eligible for Job Corps services. By giving them an avenue to access for job skill training, they can begin to rebuild their lives. And Madam Speaker, the bill also allows and helps law enforcement by allowing the U.S. Marshals Service to support other state, local, or federal law enforcement agencies that are investigating missing child cases. And finally, the bill increases oversight by requiring additional reporting to Congress on restitution orders in trafficking cases. These provisions are all essentially critically important pieces in the effort to combat sex trafficking. I want to thank my colleague Gwen Moore from Wisconsin for her advocacy, for her passion, and for her partnership on this legislation, moving it forward on a bipartisan basis. I also want to thank the leaders of the Judiciary Committee team who have recognized that this is a top priority and moved it quickly early in this session of Congress. And I look forward to working with my colleague, Senator Klobuchar from Minnesota as well, and continuing our hard work to pass each and every one of these trafficking bills, anti-trafficking bills, and get them on the President's desk so we can continue to save the lives of children. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman